exciting. I'm seeing lots of names I recognize.
So, hello everybody, welcome to this evening's event. Very excited to be here tonight to launch Miranda Corcoran's book, Witchcraft and Adolescence in American Popular Culture, Teen Witches. Congratulations, Miranda.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone at the Horror Studies Special Interest Group as well for facilitating and organizing this. It's really wonderful to be able to do something slightly different for a book for the book launch rather than just having me talk. I get to do this really cool panel setup, so thank you so much.
Oh, well, we're really happy to have you, and I've been really lucky to have a kind of sneak preview of the book already. It's really fantastic, written beautifully, so I'm looking forward to reading more, and I'm sure everybody else is very excited to read. When's it out? Is it next month?
It is. It's out in June. I don't think I have an actual date, but I do know that it's June, so very soon. You can pre-order it from the University of Wales website as well, and it's, you know, as academic books go, I think it's very reasonably priced. So, you know,
I would agree with you. As far as academic books go, it's definitely in the lower,
so, you know, get one for yourself and for your library.
That's very good. That's a good line. I'll have to trot that one out. Yeah, I think we can probably drop the link in the chat at some point. That would be good. So how we're going to run this, I'm just going to talk to Miranda briefly about the book, just by way of introduction, and then I'm going to hand over and disappear, and I'm going to leave Miranda to talk to our other fabulous panelists tonight, who she'll introduce in just a little while. We are recording. You're welcome to use the chat function throughout, but could we ask you just to hold back on questions until Miranda gives us the go-ahead towards the end? There'll be plenty of time for Q&A, but it gets a little bit confusing if you're chairing and people are dropping questions into the chat. So feel free to chat in the chat as you would, but just hold off on questions. That would be really handy. So Miranda, if you'd just like to just start us off, tell us a little bit about the book. How did it come into being? What was your kind of aim and your hope for it?
Okay, so I started thinking about this book all the way back in 2016, and I was writing an article for a special issue of the Ray Bradbury Review, which was all about Bradbury and horror. And I was writing an article about his Elliot family stories. They're these stories that he kind of came back to throughout his career. There's a whole series of them about this kind of strange, ghoulish Midwestern family. And the oldest child of this family is a 17-year-old girl named Cece, who is the main character, the titular character of a story called The April Witch. And I was writing an article about it. And the story is really about how this girl, she has the power to kind of separate her spirit from her body, and she can fly out of her body and travel around the world, and she can enter the bodies of other living creatures and experience the world from their point of view. And as I was working on this article, I kind of thought, wow, that really kind of sums up the experience of being a teenage girl, that sense of being kind of stuck in your body, stuck in your home, being kind of really exasperated with your physical sense, but also having this really active internal imaginative life. And that's sort of where the book kind of started, because it got me thinking about other teen witches. And growing up as a child of the 90s, I was a big fan of Sabrina the Teenage Witch. I was a big fan of Willow in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and of The Craft, which is, you know, a masterpiece.
90s classic, yeah.
Best. And I was kind of thinking, why is this a trope? Why is there this kind of recurring connection between teenage girls in particularly American popular culture? Why do we have this particular archetype? Because it's really unusual, this idea of a teenage girl who generally embodies all of the stereotypes we associate with teenage girls, but who is also often supernaturally powerful. So it sort of got me thinking about that. And then as I started digging into teen witches and the history of teen witches, I came to realize that the teenage witch archetype, as in the witch who is also a teenage girl, as in goes to high school, goes on dates with boys, all of that kind of stereotypical teen stuff, that this kind of comes into being after the Second World War, which I'm sure any of you who are interested in sort of cultural history, you'll probably know that the teenager is an invention of the post-World War II period. The term teenager comes into popular use around 1944, just as the Second World War is drawing to a close. And the idea of the teenager, as in a young person who remains in school beyond the primary level, whose primary social outlet is with other young people of their age, who has the free time and disposable income to kind of cultivate this peer group and collective identity. That really comes about after the Second World War. So then I started thinking about, why is it that, you know, almost as soon as the teenager comes into being as a demographic or a cultural phenomenon, the teen witch almost immediately springs into being at the same time. So that's kind of where the book started, like, why the connection between these two things, teenage girls and witches. Why, you know, why does this develop at this moment in time? And from there, I kind of went on to sort of trace the development of the teen witch from, we'll say, the 1940s up until the 2020s. And that's sort of the genesis of the book.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, that really comes across in your introduction. You kind of introduced the major preoccupation of your book. You describe it as the iconographic and imaginative connection between girls and witches. So you outline some really interesting links right back from kind of early public terror around witchcraft, and link that with kind of later 20th century concerns about teenagers and juvenile delinquency and so on, which you've introduced there. And I think obviously that becomes, you know, really key, kind of as you've suggested in the post-war period. But I'm also interested to know why you've chosen the kind of geographic location that you have for your case studies as well. You're obviously looking at American popular culture, although you do refer to kind of antecedents in say British folk horror and other such stuff. So we've talked a little about, you know, why post-war, why America specifically?
Well, I guess initially, probably because my background is American literature and culture. I'm an Americanist, so that's my area of interest. Initially, I did think about writing a more general book on teen witches, and I did think about looking at, you know, for example, British culture, and looking at, you know, Angel Blake in Blood and Satan's Claw, for example, and kind of other analogous figures. But ultimately, it would have been too unwieldy, because the cultural context and the way that the idea of adolescence developed in Britain, while it has parallels with the US context, I think there are enough differences to make that almost a separate project. And also just because, you know, the iconic image of the teenager is very much an American invention as well. It's very much a product of that post-war boom period, that era of kind of social conservatism, the McCarthy era, combined with the affluence of the post-war boom that allowed young people to stay in school longer, that allowed their parents, and I'm very much talking about kind of middle-class white teenagers here, it allowed their parents to have more disposable income to give to their children, though some of them did work in jobs after school and on weekends. There was more disposable income for teenagers to essentially almost buy themselves into this culture, because the idea of the teenager as we understand it is very much bound up with a consumer culture. So it's very much a product of that kind of consumer-driven, affluent, post-war American period.
There's a real connection between kind of the time and place that you're looking at here, but it sounds like there's a lot more to explore. So perhaps a part 2 or a collection to follow, hopefully.
Yes, definitely.
Excellent. So clearly a real key theme of your book is this connection between women and witchcraft and femininity and feminism. And I was particularly interested in the approach which you described taking in later chapters of your book. So looking at the power of teen witches and the ways that they challenge rigid representations of race and gender and class and sexual orientation. Could you talk a little bit about this? And specifically, I'm really interested in you talk about kind of more recent case studies, how these representations have evolved as we've kind of moved into fourth wave feminist models of understanding representation. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that witchcraft has always had a really fascinating connection with feminism in its various waves. I mean, one of the key texts to come out of first wave feminism was Matilda Jocelyn Gage's book, Woman, Church and State, which makes an explicit parallel between suffragists and women persecuted as witches in the early modern period. And that's a 19th century book. And it's interesting in that it isn't necessarily historically accurate, but it really cements this connection between women and feminism and witches. And then, of course, during second wave feminism, there was a real sort of latching on to the witch and the idea of the witch as the persecuted natural woman who was maybe free in her sexuality. As a second wave feminist icon. So you see this kind of intense connection between witches and the various waves of feminism, and each wave sort of adopts and reappropriates the witch in different ways. And then by the time you get to fourth wave feminism, I think that it's really ripe for an engagement with the figure of the teen witch. There is some overlap between the third wave of feminism and the teen witch figure, particularly texts like The Craft, for example, but it's really the fourth wave where the teen witch kind of becomes a key figure. And I think one of the reasons for that is the involvement of young women with fourth wave feminism. Again, you see kind of a heavier youth involvement with third wave feminism in comparison to, we'll say, first and second wave feminism. There is more of a youth involvement with the third wave. But when it comes to fourth wave feminism, I think kind of the influence of the internet and the social media and kind of online activism means that young women who would often have been excluded from the political sphere because they couldn't vote, they might not have the opportunity to get organized or really engage with political issues. Because they're online so much now, they can engage with political issues. And I think young women and even teen girls have been very much kind of driving forces with a lot of fourth wave feminist discourse. So I think for that reason, the fourth wave sort of latches onto the teen witch as a figure, whereas earlier waves of feminism may have been more interested in kind of older witches, mature witches, the hag as a symbol of resistance, for example. So I think it has to do with kind of the changing demographics of fourth wave feminism in comparison to earlier iterations. If that's not like a massive generalization.
No, not at all. So very contemporary representations are obviously very relevant to your study here then. Look, I'm really looking forward to hearing your discussion with your panel of witchy experts, of which I'm not one. So I'm going to back out of this discussion a little bit. I'm going to ask your panelists to join us in just a sec. But just before I do that, I would just like to wrap up by asking you, before you introduce your panelists, what your favorite case study was from your research.
Oh, that's a difficult question. But one book I became very obsessed with over the course of this study is actually not a work of fiction, but a historical study. It's a book called The Devil in Massachusetts, a modern inquiry into the Salem witch trials. And it was published by a journalist and historian called Marion L. Starkey in 1949. So just the immediate post-World War II period. And it's a really interesting book because it sets itself up as a modern exploration of the Salem witch trials, a study from the modern scientific point of view. And she really emphasizes the role that psychoanalysis plays in her interpretation. But the main reason I find it so fascinating, and other writers who have studied Starkey's work have said the same thing, she treats adolescence really anachronistically. She writes about the young girls, the accusing girls at the center of the Salem witch trials, as if they were contemporary 1940s teenage girls. So she blames the witch trials, for example, on the sexual frustrations and the boredom of these girls. She connects their behavior to puberty, but she also refers to them as Bobby Soxers. She compares their, hysterical, in air quotes, behavior to the behavior of teen girls at, like, you know, Frank Sinatra concerts and things like that. So it's fascinatingly anachronistic, and I just find that that's so interesting. So I think that is probably my favorite case study for that reason.
And really kind of cements those connections again between.
And I think she was one of the first as well. And I would almost argue, and I do in the book really, that her study, The Devil in Massachusetts, is almost in some ways less about the Salem witch trials and more about trying to figure out the modern teenage girl and what the teenage girl is and what threat she may or may not pose to the culture.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure your panelists will have lots of thoughts as well. So if I can ask Peg and Chloe and Shannon to join us, and then I'm gonna hand over to you, Miranda, and I'm gonna leave you guys to it. I'm very much looking forward to listening in rather than chairing. So enjoy, everybody. I'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. Okay, so welcome to all of our panelists. So I wanted to kind of start by saying a little bit about why this is a panel discussion for a book launch, because initially when this idea was suggested to me, I was told that, you know, I could maybe like do a presentation about my book or just talk about my book and then do a Q&A at the end. And I kind of thought, well, that's interesting, but, you know, I have a whole book coming out and, you know, people can read it and this will give them a flavor. But what I really want to do is I want to talk to other scholars and other critics who are interested in the topic of witchcraft and get their perspective. So it's not just me. So I've assembled a group of people, some of whom have influenced me with their work and some of whom are up and coming scholars of witchcraft, to come here and give their perspective on witchcraft, on how we understand witchcraft as a culture, and also about why there is that connection between teen girls and witchcraft. So the first panelist that I'm going to introduce to you, and I'll introduce everyone and then we can get started with the questions. So our first panelist is Pegaloi, and she is a freelance film and TV critic, a former professor of media studies and co-editor with Hannah Sanders of The New Generation Witches, Teenage Witchcraft in Contemporary Culture. And that's a book that influenced me massively in the researching and writing of my own book. So I'm really happy that she could be here today. She's also the co-editor of Carnival and the American Grotesque, critical essays on the HBO series. With Hannah, she also co-organized 2 scholarly conferences at Harvard University on paganism, witchcraft, and media. Peg's forthcoming book, The Witching Hour: How Witches Enchanted the World, is a cultural analysis of the witch in contemporary media. Peg was also one of the co-founders of The Witch's Voice and wrote about film and TV for the site for over a decade. And her long-running blog, The Witching Hour, can now be found on Substack. So, hi, Peg, and thank you very much for joining us.
Hi.
Our second speaker is Chloe Campbell, and Chloe is a commissioning editor working in publishing based in the northwest of England. And Chloe is currently an MA English Studies student at Manchester Metropolitan University. Chloe participated in their specialized Gothic studies pathway. Her research interests are satanic witches, and particularly the figure of the witch housewife, and I love that, in 20th and 21st century culture. In October 2022, Chloe will be starting a PhD, further studying the witch wife. And for those of you who are interested in the topic, on Sunday, July 24th, Chloe will be giving a talk about the witch wife in literature, television, and film. And if you follow Romancing the Gothic on Twitter, you can find out more details about this talk and other events. So welcome, Chloe.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And then our last speaker is Shannon Hughes Spence, and Shannon is a graduate of University College Dublin. She graduated with an MSc in sociology. Currently, she's a research assistant with a focus on gender and health. Having titled her MSc thesis, The Reclamation of the Witch as a Symbol of Female Empowerment, Hughes Spence is continuing to further explore and expand on the phenomenon of Irish people reclaiming the image of the witch and witchcraft itself, and how this overlaps with Ireland's dark history of the persecution of women under the Free State and the Catholic Church. And findings of this project are shared through social media on Twitter at Witches of Ireland, and on Instagram at Kailaka Naharan. Hughes Spence hopes to begin a PhD in 2022 and 2023. I don't know why that was so hard for me to say, but welcome, Shannon.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So thank you all so much for coming and for joining me. As I said at the beginning, rather than just me talking for an hour, I really just wanted to bring together a group of people who are working on witchcraft, who are interested in witchcraft, just to talk about the topic a little bit more and share some ideas and just have a conversation. So I wanted to begin with a bit of a general question, and I just was curious as to what is your history with witches or witchcraft? How did you get interested in the subject? I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, I'm very old, so I'm going to go first because, you know, I might not have as much time left as the rest of you.
And you're first alphabetically as well. So.
Oh, all right. So I have to say my interest was really kindled in what then became, I didn't know it would at the time, what became sort of my wheelhouse in this topic, which was seeing witches represented in film. And I was about 10 years old. And there was this made-for-TV movie, which was a big thing in the United States in the 1970s. It was called Crowhaven Farm. And it's quite dated. And if you watch it now, it's kind of cheesy and a bit silly. But it's Hope Lang stars in it. And she's this woman who inherits a farm in Salem, Massachusetts. And she finds out that she was her ancestors were there during the witch trials, and she starts having these visions, and she realizes she might be reincarnated as someone who was there. And there's all these flashback sequences of people in sort of really bad pilgrim outfits, and but it just at my impressionable age at the time, I was just kind of blown away that there was this connection between what happened in history and then this woman in the modern day, like having this overtake her. And then from that point on, anything and everything about witchcraft, I would, they didn't have children controls on the TV back in those days. And our parents were busy. So, I was watching and reading so many age inappropriate things.
Brilliant.
So that was my beginning interest, I guess.
It's weird. I have a kind of similar story. So I'm just going to hop in before I ask our other two panelists. But when I was about 7 years old, when I was in primary school, our teachers would every so often just, wheel in the VCR, and we would get to watch a video in the afternoon. And one fateful day, that video was the Disney film Hocus Pocus. And ever since then, I've been obsessed with Salem and witches. So I really blame whatever teacher decided that, she couldn't be bothered teaching us that evening and was just going to show a video instead. So it's fascinating, though, how media is often our first contact with the concept of witches, whether historical or contemporary. So Chloe and Shannon, what about you? How did you get interested in witchcraft?
Hocus Pocus, 100%. I was
it's all Disney's fault.
It really is. I think I was about 6 when I first watched it, and just from that moment on, seeing Bette Midler in all her glory as a witch, I was obsessed. And then any witch movies I could get my little tiny child hands on, I just couldn't stop consuming them. And I loved Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and I seen that like her initials were SS for Sabrina Spellman and mine is SS for Shannon Spence, so I assumed I was a witch when I was a child because of that.
I love it.
And then my dad is from Scotland, so the Scottish witch trials, they were like a massive interest of his, and then I kind of just started stealing his books on the topic. So it was definitely like representations within the media, but also the historical aspects that I've always been interested in since I could probably read, I suppose.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And what about you, Chloe?
So I am from Lancaster in England.
Okay.
Yeah. People who are interested in witches will probably know the connection. But for anyone who doesn't, in Lancaster in 1612, the Pendle witches were tried and executed. And so even though Lancaster isn't really like Salem in terms of consumerism and witch tourism, there are small signs And so I grew up being aware of the Pendle witches and the Lancashire witches. And then similarly to what other people have said, it was the media really. I think probably The Worst Witch was one of my first introductions. The British one, though, I'm aware there's an American one, which I've never seen, but there was an English one, so I was a big fan of that. And then one day I turned on the TV and I saw Charmed, and Charmed kind of changed everything for me. Yeah, because Charmed then led to Buffy, and then Buffy led to the Gothic and the modern Gothic. So
yeah, it's amazing how similar a lot of our stories are, in that, you know, so much of our early exposure to witches was through the media, but also there was a kind of fascination with historical witches, because one of the first things I did after seeing Hocus Pocus was kind of go off to my, you know, probably some little encyclopedia in the school classroom and learn, you know, try and learn about Salem. So there's that kind of dual fascination between, you know, with both contemporary representations, but also the history. And that's one thing I wanted to ask you all about. You all work on contemporary witchcraft, whether in terms of practice or representation. And I was curious to know how you think the modern witch relates to older ideas about witchcraft, you know, those derived either from the ancient world or from the early modern period when the witch stereotype really crystallizes. Do you think that there's a complete break, or do you think there's kind of maybe a more interesting lineage there? I don't know who wants to go first. I really should have thought of this better. Do you have something you want to say, Chloe? Just because you're the person on the screen, I can see you, so I'm picking on you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah. Well, I think similarly to what I said about, you know, the media that got me interested in witches, something that I think about is in the 1990s and the early 2000s, a lot of the witch narratives were focusing on paganism, you know, goddess worship, evoking Wicca as well, whether that is a truthful representation or not. But I think there is that reference to like the ancient world, and, you know, goddesses like Hecate often feature in these witch narratives. And then if I think about something like The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which is obviously a lot more recent, that's got, you know, 15th century ideas about witches and witches,
the satanic witch.
Yeah, satanic witches. So I do think it's really interesting how all witch texts do seem to be referencing the past or past ideas about witches.
That's really interesting, because even if a witch text is contemporary, there will usually be a reference to the past or to ancient witches or early modern witches, or particularly for US texts, Salem in particular. So that's really fascinating. What about you, Shannon? Do you have any thoughts? Or
yeah, I guess because I'm interviewing people in Ireland who identify as witches, one thing that strikes me is that in their practice of witchcraft now, they find it kind of nice and a bit like they're honoring their ancestors by relating their practice back to what may have been practiced before. So like traditional Irish folk magic, things like that. And they would always give examples of like Halloween, just a classic celebration, or Samhain, where it's very traditional to, you know, there'd be a barnbrack, which is basically like this breaded cake thing, and you'd find a little ring inside, and whoever like finds the ring is going to get married. But like that's a form of divination almost. And then there's the culcanon, which is a traditional dish. It's like mashed potatoes with kale. It sounds horrible, but it's actually really nice. And then the tradition would be to like wrap coins in tinfoil, and, you know, you find the coins, you find fortune. So it's just little things like that these witches would engage in constantly to tap back into traditions that they feel were around before then. So it's linking that past and present.
Yeah, and I think as well in Ireland, considering our, you know, very and we'll probably come back to this, our very contentious relationship with the Catholic Church, I wonder if it is kind of empowering for certain people to be able to link back to the sort of the pre-Catholic Ireland.
Yeah, I don't want to rant on that. I'll let Peg talk.
Okay, Peg, do you want to join in?
Oh, sure. Thanks. I have so many thoughts on this, but what I will say is that because witchcraft, modern witchcraft, as it's generally practiced now, which is means that it's an outgrowth of Wicca, which was essentially born out of whole cloth in the 1950s. I think the idea that it's a relatively new religion, and yet so many of the traditions, the beliefs, you know, and the imagery and the iconography of it is very ancient. I think there's a tendency for modern practitioners to really want to engage with this older stuff. But at the same time, there's this interesting disconnection between, oh, I am a witch and I want to be a witch and I want to practice witchcraft, and it's all very benevolent and positive. And then some of the images of the witch from antiquity that we're most fascinated by have to do with the witch being evil and terrible and scary or seductive or all these other things. And so for me, there's always been this really interesting split between, or it's not even a split, it's a continuum really of all the different things that a witch has been portrayed as through history, and what a witch still is. And I think we're now seeing, as witchcraft is once again having a booming cultural moment, especially on social media, I think we're starting to see yet again retweaking of these definitions, and people wanting to call themselves things that are much more specific or much more focused, or maybe eschewing that term witch entirely. So yeah, this to me, I feel that there always will be, whether people admit it or not, that fascination with the witch of the past.
Yeah.
As it informs contemporary practice, definitely.
Definitely. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think that actually leads on nicely to the next question that I have lined up. And I wanted to ask all of you, what do you think of the recent appropriation or potentially reappropriation of the witch as a sort of feminist icon or a symbol of resistance? And I'm thinking in particular of the recent reformation in the US of the activist group Witch, which stands for the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, best name ever. Or in the Irish context, we had a group called Witches for Repeal, who were very active during the campaign 4 years ago now for the repeal of our very draconian abortion laws. So I'm kind of curious as to why you all think, or why you don't, why is the witch a sort of potent symbolic or political figure?
I actually wrote about this witchcraft as activism, and I'd be happy to post a link to the things that I wrote about it. But
do.
Witch was such a cool organization, and I want to say they actually had a number of acronyms that would sort of play around with inventing new ones. So they started out as the Witches International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, and there's dozens of them. There was one that I remember called Women Intent on Toppling Consumerist Holidays, you know, so whatever sort of thing they were protesting at the time. But I think it's, and then of course we had the hexing of Donald Trump, who deserves so much more than hexing, obviously. So I think that I wouldn't even necessarily call it a reappropriation. I think it's a reinvigoration or a revalorization of that spirit of activism that brilliantly was embodied by mostly women in the 1960s. But this idea of the witch as a rebel, as an outlier, as an outsider, that's kind of always been with us. And I think I find it quite exciting in a way, because there's so many issues in the socio-political sphere now that are directly affecting, and I know we're definitely in a moment where we are redefining gender identity, which I think is a wonderful thing. But in terms of how women are connected to feminism and the history of women's oppression, et cetera, that has been based on their sex for the most part, it's a straight line back to the witch burnings and the witch craze of Europe. So I think that adopting of all that symbolism and that history is spot on. And I'd be quite happy to see more of it. I think I want to say it was witch, when it was reinvigorated in Chicago, it was just kind of basic. They wanted to do what they were doing, but I think most of us are familiar with I know I'm talking for a long time, the all black, the veils and the hats, and it's very anonymous look with the black signs with the white letters. It's all really, really cool looking aesthetically and very impactful. but that was first brought about by the witch. I think the witches in Portland, Oregon. And then other witch groups in Boston and other places adopted that. I have not, of course, we're not having that many big protests these days. Obviously, we need to go back to that, but because of the pandemic, but I find it a comforting presence when I see them. Actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I do love that. Like, one of the things that, you know, one of the original witch groups did back in the 1960s was like run amok through a bridal fair, and they just, you know, their protests were so creative, and they came up with chants and everything, and they were just brilliant. I love them. What about you, Shannon? I know you've done some work on surrounding witchcraft in the Irish context.
Yeah, so it was those pictures of people in the US showing up with the black hats and the black veils that got me hooked. And I was like, what is the meaning behind this unreal imagery? So then I seen it within the Irish context during the repeal referendum, which was to repeal Ireland's horrendous abortion laws. It's repealed,
by the way, 4 years ago today.
Yeah. So I seen people dressing as witches during those protests, and I was like, hang on, there's something going on here. I need to do a bit of research. So that kind of led to my thesis, and I discovered that although Ireland has a limited history of witch trials, we do have some, and they are horrendous. But our Irish witches, in my experience, are reclaiming the image of the witch, not because we have an intense past of witch trials, but because we have a really dark and intense past of persecuting women for just being women. So dark. But the mother and baby homes, or the Magdalene laundries, or the Magdalene asylums, there's quite a few names for them, were homes for unmarried mothers and people who went through reformatory schools. They would end up there. They'd be put there by the state or by their families for bringing, you know, shame because they were unmarried and pregnant. So with that was horrendous. They suffered abuse. They had to do unpaid labor. There was mass graves discovered recently with bodies of children and women inside. It's really dark, really horrendous. And then only a couple of years later, this repeal movement is happening, and, you know, they're referencing how Irish women's bodies have been controlled through the Catholic Church and the state for so long, and the harm that it's causing. So during the repeal movement, there was a short film that was put together. It's like maybe 4 or 5 minutes long, and it's called We Face This Land. And it was based on a poem, and it's on YouTube. You can check it out. It's fabulous. And there was this group of women, a lot of artists and like community workers and things like that. And they were standing on a beach, and it opened up with a line saying that we face the water, and they were making reference to witch trials and how women who were accused of witchcraft had to face trial by water. But these women were using that witch imagery, saying that they have to face trial by water because they had to flee to the UK to access abortion services, basic healthcare, because they are being denied that because of the control the Catholic Church and the state had on Irish women's bodies. So the witch image has been used quite extensively, I would say, throughout Irish activism, especially in the last few years.
Yeah, it's fascinating that, like, in a way, the witch is almost simultaneously outside of that kind of patriarchal power as we imagine the witch. And like, obviously there are a huge number of issues with like feminism's engagement with witchcraft and historical accuracy, but like the way we imagine the witch, she's kind of simultaneously this figure who is outside of patriarchal power, but also very much invested and victimized by that same power. So there's kind of this element of aspiration, but also this kind of crystallization of tragedy within the witch that I think is so fascinating. Chloe, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, in terms of thinking about the witch as a persecuted woman, and that's obviously an image that endures even in the media. There are often references back to Salem and to other witch trials. So I think, I mean, I really love the quote by Carol Carlson, who's a historian, and she says that witches confront society with ideas about women, but also fears about women. And I do think that the witch being such a powerful image with so many different connotations, it really is, you know, it really confronts people with this idea of kind of unregulated female power. And I do think it's interesting that even newer series like The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, in their own way, they reference WITCH with their own group Wicca, right? WICCA. and that's their form of activism within a school environment that is seeking to prohibit them reading certain materials. And so it is very interesting that it seems different generations can apply this to their own kind of oppression and causes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the more recent teen witch texts, things like The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, and also American Horror Story Coven, which deals very explicitly with like rape culture and victim blaming, they're very explicit in their connection to contemporary political movements and conversations. Like a lot of the time, it's not even coded; it's right there in the text. So another thing I wanted to ask was just about the figure of the teen witch more broadly. And as I mentioned in my conversation with Laura at the start of this event, one of the things that really kind of kicked off my interest in this topic and really got me on the road to writing this book was the realization that the teen witch as a sort of cultural icon emerges in the United States in the 1940s and the early 50s, just as the teenager emerges as a cultural demographic, and just as the teenage girl becomes a highly visible figure in pop culture and in the media. And I was wondering why you think, because I have a whole book where I get to talk about this, but I was wondering, why do you think that right from the outset, there was this cultural tendency to conflate teenage girls with witches and to link those two figures? Do you want to go first, Chloe? Because you're the person I can see on screen. So.
Yeah, sure. And I'm actually just thinking about the time that I attended a talk, and I think you were actually talking about this, Miranda, and I was learning so much about, you know, that mid-century period, you know, the teenager becoming a class of their own, and then all these representations of teen witches. And I do think it's a really interesting period. I mean, it's a period that I'm interested in because you also see the witch as a housewife merge at the same time.
Absolutely, yeah, that's actually really fascinating, because those two things do happen at the same time.
They do in that post-war period, and I think with teenagers and teenage girls especially, I do think it's a fear of like a cultural fear or a cultural anxiety about teenage girls, and you know, not even just the threat that they pose, but maybe the intensity of them, the emotional intensity, the changes that young girls go through. But seeing them as, you know, trying to work out who are they and how are they separate from women, or how are they the same as adult women? And it just seems like a cultural kind of mediation of women in general. And it's just so fascinating. I can't wait to read your book.
Oh, thank you. No, absolutely. And I agree. I think like a lot of it is not even so much a, you know, straightforward teenage girls bad and scary and witches bad and scary. It's almost the witch almost becomes this, you know, cultural medium through which people try to figure out what the teenage girl is. And then later on also through which teenage girls try to figure out who they are as well. So I think the teen witch does a lot of cultural work. She's not just, you know, a reflection of what's scary. She's just, you know, this figure through which all of these issues are kind of worked out. Shannon, do you have any thoughts on that connection between young women or teen girls and witches?
Yeah, I think Chloe said it really nicely with the emotional intensity. Like, if there's anything that's horrendous, it's being a teenage girl.
Yeah. You could not pay me to go back.
No, it's so intense. It's so difficult to try and navigate. And I think when you are in that space and you're confused and you feel like you have very little control over your life because you're not a child, but you're not an adult, it's very easy to relate to the idea of a witch and even witchcraft, because there's potentially this practice that can help you gain a little bit more control over your life. So I can definitely see why there's a massive appeal from teenage girls being drawn to witchcraft as a teenage girl who was once a teenage girl drawn to witchcraft. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Peg?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on this. So I think Arthur Miller very brilliantly explores this in The Crucible, where it's because it's really all about these teenage girls who have very not glamorous lives, who have very really horrible lives. I was a tour guide in Salem a number of years ago, and one of the stories I would tell was in one of these houses was how in the course of their domestic duties, these young girls who were servants, like if they didn't have a good prospect of marriage or whatever, they were usually working as servants, and they would one of the leading causes of death of these young women was infections caused by burns, because they so frequently burned themselves working around the cook fire in the house or whatever. So I think about that, about how our image of the Salem witch trials has so much to do with these teenage girls who are suddenly given a little bit of power, a little bit of attention, a little bit of removal from their horrible daily lives, right? So there's that. But there's also the fact that, you know, my goodness, we couldn't have young women suddenly become viable players in the economy and like the social contract or whatever without demonizing them. My goodness, we can't have that. Pardon me, I'm getting a little emotional here. But like, of course, it's the minute that a female teenager becomes a thing, she has to also be a witch, you know? And it all goes back to those jerks, Kramer and Sprenger, you know? All witchcraft stems from carnal desire, which is in women insatiable. This fear of female sexuality is at the absolute core of so many of the different permutations of the witchcraft thing. We see it in The Wizard of Oz. You know, Dorothy, those glittering red shoes, they are a potent symbol of of puberty, of her female sensual power, which she has in spades over this green-skinned old hag-like witch. And that's purely what that battle is between them. That, you know, the Wicked Witch of the West wants her youth and her sensual vitality. It's not the shoes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
and it's the two type of women that it's the two types of women we fear as well. That kind of young woman who's coming into her power, and then the older woman who doesn't seem to have a social use because she is old and no longer fertile.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think what I said earlier made it sound as if, oh, it's just got to be men or whatever demonizing these young women. No, it's also older women whose place in that social order is possibly threatened. And obviously that's a disturbing thing, you know, that there's this cult of youth that is shut down. But of course, I feel like now we're seeing something quite opposite from that, in that well, don't get me started on ageism and all, you know, but the hagsploitation, you know, hashtag hagsploitation thing that we see. Anyway, that's, maybe we'll discuss that later. I don't know.
But yeah, no, that's really interesting. And actually, I kind of wanted to, I think this is something people have touched on already, but obviously beyond cultural representations of teenage girls as witches, and quite often these cultural representations are created by adults, teenage girls themselves have a very long history of being interested in magic and the occult. I mean, one of the things that I talk about in my book is maybe a precursor to the teen witch archetype is the Fox sisters, you know, who were teenage girls living in upstate New York in the 1840s, who basically inaugurated spiritualism. So there has been like a long link between teenage girls and the otherworldly. But even kind of more recently, when I was a teenager in the early 2000s, there was this popular magazine for teen girls. It was a British magazine. It's called Ms. spelled with 2 Z's. And it had like a spell of the week. So every week, in addition to, you know, gossip about NSYNC and makeup tips and things like that, there would also be like a spell that you could try at home. And this was a mainstream magazine for teenage girls. So there does seem to be this connection. And I'm kind of curious as to why you all think that teenage girls themselves are really interested in witchcraft, and teenage girls are very often drawn to the occult. Do you want to start, Peg? Because you're the person I can see on screen right now.
Oh, okay. Can you repeat the question? Why are teenage girls drawn to?
Absolutely, yeah, drawn to the occult. And I know this is something that you write about and that you talk about in your own research as well. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
I do want to say, and thank you for your shout out earlier in the bio about the book that I did with Hannah. I do want to mention that Hannah unfortunately couldn't join us today, but that collection would not have happened without her. And I do want to tell you that Hannah, who is now my best friend in the world, we met at a Buffy conference, the first ever Buffy conference at the University of East Anglia some years ago.
So cool.
But so Hannah really, I think, is one of the people who pioneered research into the teenage witch, especially in terms of the teen witch's presence in media and what was at that time just the fledgling examples of social media. And I think that we've already sort of touched on this idea that teenage girls are definitely interested in pushing at boundaries, pushing at limits. And we certainly see this represented in the coming of age genre, where you have the young woman who is pushing at how, you know, her burgeoning sexuality, and she's sort of trying that on. And of course, people take advantage of that. A really great example is the film Ripe. I don't know if you've seen, starring Viggo Mortensen, and I wish I could remember the young actresses' names. They were quite young. Great film. I think that we see that again, and I hate to keep equating witchcraft with sexuality, but I don't know. It's this idea that
Definitely there.
that you know that as the young women come into their power, it's so tied to that, and maybe we have imposed that, maybe we have grafted that onto the teenage girl, just culturally speaking, but because I don't think it's all about like, oh, puberty makes young women crazy or whatever. I think it is about starting to find your place in the world. How do you fit into the world? Like when young people go off to college and they start realizing, wow, I can be someone else that I wasn't before. And it can be about the music I like, or the books that people are telling me about, or these friends that are so different from people I've known before. And so this act of discovery is so much, I think it really mirrors the kind of texts that we see when we have young people studying magic and studying the occult arts. You know, it's this process of discovery. It goes way back even to T.H. White's, The Sword and the Stone, where Arthur is learning things in the woods from Merlin or what have you. I think that what I think we're not seeing that much of these days is the idea of the young witch with an older teacher. I think there's a lot of this DIY, you know, and you're just kind of learning it yourself, or you're naturally born into it, or that kind of thing. And I have other thoughts about that, but I think it's almost like you couldn't have a teenage girl archetype that did not include witchcraft somehow. And I've been noticing this interesting thing in television in recent years, which is that a lot of shows, especially that focus on female characters, they have a witchcraft episode. Like the show could have absolutely nothing to do with witchcraft or the occult, but there's a witchcraft episode. Like in Pen 15, there's this great witchcraft episode. The recent reboot of Sex and the City had a witchcraft episode. And I think it's really, it's fun when they go there. I wish they would take it a little bit further, but anyway, now I hear from somebody else.
That's really interesting. So yeah, Shannon or Chloe, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I'd just like to share something I found in a charity shop, or like a thrift store for people in the US. I came across this spells for teenage witches, and it was
Nice.
decent. And I picked it up thinking, oh, it's going to be like, so like just like for children, basically, thinking it'd be like, you know, child friendly and stuff, even though it said teenage witches. And it came out in 2000, and I opened it, and it introduces you to like the witches' sabbats. It goes into detail about different holidays, and I noticed there's of course one or two love spells has to be in there, I guess. But they came with major warnings. It was like, you know, you really just think, if you want this person in your life, is there any other way to go about it? Maybe they're not the right person for you. So it comes with a warning. But then I also noticed, which I thought was really interesting, especially because it came out 22 years ago, there was a hands-off spell for dealing with someone who is touching you and it's unwanted. And maybe if you've already tried to say like, no, back off, or if you don't feel comfortable expressing that verbally, they have a little spell for that. And I just thought that was really interesting. And there was another one, like a please don't shout spell for parents who are arguing. And I just thought it was really interesting to put this in a book from 22 years ago for teenage witches.
That's fascinating. And there are like a lot of books for teen witches in particular from that period. I know that when I was a teenager, you could buy them in Waterstones. So it's interesting that there is that whole market for books and texts just for teenage witches. Chloe, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, that just makes me think of when I was a teenager, and one of my friends, their babysitter, actually had a book that was by Silver Ravenwolf, which I think a few people might be familiar.
Yeah, I've seen some of her books.
Yeah.
All right, yeah.
And
They just put that in the chat. That was a weird bit of synchronicity.
Oh, weird.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah. I wonder if it's the same. Yeah, teen witch books, and they were very similar to the book that Shannon has just showed. They were spells and information for teenage witches, and I just, you know, that interested me more. But thinking about kind of representations and this connection between teenage girls and witchcraft, I think perhaps there's something to do with, you know, teenage girls in patriarchal cultures not really having much social power. And I think the witch and the teen witch, especially in being such a close representation, it offers quite a potent image of someone who has extraordinary power and who can use extraordinary power to influence things around them. And I, you know, thinking of it being quite, you know, gendered and to do with biological sex as well, perhaps. This is power that relates to like a mental power, not necessarily like strength or agility. I think it's quite interesting in the way that something like Buffy has, you know, Buffy is like a superhero, and then Willow, she learns the craft and she becomes a really powerful witch, and it's almost like conquering maybe an anxiety or something that you feel you lack. But I do think it's very interesting.
Yeah, and I think actually one of the things that's really interesting about Willow is that her confidence grows as her knowledge of witchcraft grows. So there's that kind of parallel, like she's coming into her own as a person as she's coming into her own as a witch. So there's that parallel about like growing up. And actually maybe Willow is kind of a good connection to to the next question I wanted to ask, which is, what role do you think popular media like film and TV and, you know, mainstream fiction has in introducing young people and particularly young women to witchcraft? And I guess, like, I mean, you know, it isn't, obviously it's not just young girls, and it's not just, you know, young cis girls either. I think, you know, it's something that is appealing for many young people. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that sort of that role of popular culture.
I know that when the, if you don't mind, I'm just going to jump in. When the craft came out, it was just a few months after we founded the Witch's Voice, which was this sort of gathering place and networking thing. And again, the internet was in its infancy. And Hannah's research was started with some online stuff. And what was happening with the craft was it brought so many teenage girls into witchcraft. And there were two things that occurred there. One was that they modeled their practice on the craft, which was good and bad. It was really well-researched script and actually had some solid Wicca stuff in it. And of course, there's a good, I suppose, lesson in that, like, don't dabble too much because this could happen, you'll go nuts. But also, I think that the internet itself allowed for a certain amount of privacy. So we saw at the time, and Hannah details this in her research too a little bit, although her research is mostly in the UK at that point, that girls that lived in a town where it was like the heavily Southern Baptist or whatever, or their families were not, were judgmental of this, they could keep that secret and they could somehow find engagement with witchcraft communities and witchcraft information without anyone knowing about it. So in other words, even if you kept like, like a diary or something, and someone might discover it in the flesh, but out in the internet, it's in this, ethereal space. And it could be almost, it's just yours, even because it's out there. And I thought that was a beautiful thing. And I think also that it also allowed people to understand that there were people everywhere, that were interested in the same kind of thing. So there was even if they weren't coming together physically in the physical realm, there was a coming together. And it just, it was, I think you cannot overestimate the impact of that particular film on the teenage witchcraft community. And I know we
100%.
Oh, it was enormous.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Like that movie was a huge influence on me just as a human being. So absolutely, yeah. So Chloe and Shannon, do you have any thoughts on that?
Just to say that it influenced me too. I think about the craft all the time.
Yeah, same.
And again, it's just, you know, seeing these films or TV shows or reading these books, it's such a strong image. And it's perhaps how most people are introduced to the idea of a witch. If they haven't read about, you know, historical witch trials, perhaps, it's perhaps how most people find these narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. Shannon, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, in my own research, one of the first questions, the first question I asked somebody during an interview is what was their first encounter with the image of the witch? And every time it's been through different things within the media, whether it's Hocus Pocus, The Craft, Sabrina, Buffy. So it is definitely, I think, a major influence on how people become familiar with witches and witchcraft. And what I also find really interesting, and there's been a couple of different studies on it, is once somebody is a practitioner of witchcraft and takes it seriously as a spiritual practice, they might turn away slightly from witch media for fear of different films and TV shows sharing their spiritual practice as something that might be a little bit silly, like, you know, Harry Potter spells or something that they don't feel is accurately representing them. Maybe they think it looks too evil or devilish, like the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. So yeah, I definitely think it's a gateway, but once people are through that gate, I think maybe their opinions might change.
Absolutely.
It's a guilty pleasure almost then.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to ask one more like proper serious question before I open the floor to the audience. And I think this is quite an important question. So even though I've had to skip a few things I wanted to ask, I think this is an important one. But I have found that where we get representations of the witch as an empowered figure, particularly recent representations like The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina or the girls in American Horror Story Coven, or even Thomasin and the Witch, quite often those empowered representations or those empowering representations of teen witches are focused on white, able-bodied, cis women. And do you think that there is a representation problem in contemporary media centered on teen witches? And if so, do you think this will change in the future, or is it starting to change now? I don't know who wants to go first there.
I think that one of my participants mentioned this before, and they related it to the marriage equality referendum that was passed in Ireland a few years ago. They were working in theatre production at the time, and every play was about marriage equality, and it had to kind of go through a period of saturation before it became the norm. And I think that's kind of similar to what's happening with the teen witch, because it's everywhere now. It has been predominantly white cis women that we see on screen. So I do think, like the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina and American Horror Story Coven, there are more representations coming, and I hope the teen witch isn't going to plateau before it takes back up to give us those representations, because I think it's really important for people to be represented as teenage witches who don't look like Sabrina.
Yeah, absolutely. Chloe and Peg, do you have any thoughts? I know that, like, for example, in terms of thinking about that, you know, very white, cis, able-bodied view of the teen witch, there are some very good books that are coming out at the moment. For example, there's a great one that came out in 2020 by a writer called Aidan Thomas, and it's called Cemetery Boys, and it's about a trans Latino boy who wants to follow in his family's footsteps and become a powerful witch, and it's an excellent book. So I do think maybe it's starting to change. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Chloe and Peg.
I will say
Yeah,
again,
I do think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Chloe.
Peg, you go ahead. You go ahead.
age before youth, I guess. So I want to say again, because when I came into the community, this was a major issue, because in those days, because so much of what modern witchcraft was based in Wicca. Wicca was born in the British Isles. It was all white people practicing it in the 1950s. And there was this idea that if you were initiated into, say, Gardnerian or an Alexandrian tradition, that there was this straight line, and for better or worse, those earlier witches in the mid-century were mostly white, almost entirely white people. The first time I met an African-American witch, I ran into this guy on the train, on the subway in Boston, and we were crowded together. I just have to tell this story, I'm sorry. We're crowded together. He's right next to me. He's this little African-American man with a hat with all these like POW and Vietnam pins. He'd obviously served in Vietnam, and he had this huge honking gold pentacle. And I was like, this guy, and he had this sweet, gentle energy, but you're stuffed together on the train, literally this far apart. So finally we're stuck there. The train stopped. I said, finally, I say, I like your necklace. And we start talking. And it turns out he used to hang out with Sybil Leek when she lived in Arizona back in the day. And he was a crack astrologer who, just hung out with these people back in the 60s. And eventually we got to this point where he agreed to do my chart, for free. And he said, because you remind me a little bit of my wife. Her birthday is October 22nd. And I'm like, well, mine's the 23rd. He's like, well, I knew that, kind of thing. He was amazing. And so, but again, the point of the story is that for me, that was an amazing kind of representation, because he was not the typical witch that I knew. And now the one good thing I'll say about American Horror Story Coven, which has some problems and some flaws, which started out with a great premise, is that it really pushes that idea of representation and diversity, which I think is great. I don't think it does it in such positive ways all the time, but at least it's a thought. And now we're seeing so many permutations and expressions of who a witch is. It's really opening that up. And I think the time is really ripe for that discussion, especially at a time when certainly in the United States, white supremacy is an absolutely horrific growing problem. So I, for one, really welcome that. But I will tell you that back in the day, there were like problems with, gender polarity discussions and all these other things. And I feel that it's useful to look at our history and really also study a lot of what brought us to that point. But I don't really like this idea that you're a gatekeeper if you if you say to people, well, yeah, but this isn't how it was in the 60s or 70s. It's important that we understand that there is a through line and how things have changed, because if we don't learn from that history, we don't really necessarily understand our moment in the present. And I think that moment in the present is also constantly changing and evolving. And this is probably one of the most exciting and yet in a way most dangerous times for people to be saying, I'm a witch and this is what I'm doing, because now we have crazy people out there saying that now witchcraft should become a crime punishable by whatever.
Absolutely. Though it is interesting that, in terms of like representation and who is considered a witch, that there has been sort of a recent, while there's been an upsurge in, young people becoming interested in Wicca and forms of witchcraft that originated in the British Isles and in Europe, there also have been a lot of young people of color becoming interested in practices like hoodoo and root work, Santeria, things like that, and sort of reclaiming that as part of their heritage as well. So I think that's a really interesting trend as well. I was going, I think, was it Chloe, you had something you wanted to say as well?
I was just going to say something about the Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, because I think in terms of diversity, it is a much more diverse witch narrative than anything that came before it. Like Peg said, I think perhaps American Horror Story made a really positive change and influence, even if it wasn't perfect. But I think in Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, the characters of Roz and Theo and Ambrose, they do challenge the sort of white, cis, heteronormative witch. And I think that is great. And even as a fan, like, you can tell that people love this diversity. But then on the other hand, Sabrina as the protagonist is still a straight white young woman. And in relation to that, you know, the Charmed reboot, which was Charmed was rebooted fairly recently, wasn't it, with a different cast, a cast with people of colour, and I think it was really celebrated for that, but unfortunately it hasn't been renewed. I think it's been cancelled. So I do think it's interesting to think about these witch narratives and the casting choices and the narrative. I do think it's changing, but I think there's perhaps a way to go.
Absolutely. So I'm very much aware that we sort of run over with our panel discussion time, but like it's just mostly because everyone had such interesting things to say. So apologies for that, but I'm just taking a look at the time there. We might just take maybe 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So if you would like to either raise your hand or put a question in the chat, I will warn you, I'm doing this on my phone, so that might not be the easiest thing, but yeah, do raise your hand or stick your questions in the chat if you have one, if you have a question. And let me see how I can maneuver to the questions in my phone, because yeah, that's not easy, because I was using, oh, there we go. Yeah, I was using my laptop,
Miranda,
but
you want one of us to read them if that would be easier.
Oh,
somewhere.
I think I've got it. I think I've got it. Yes, I do. I'm using my phone because I'm in a hotel room, and because I'm at an event at the moment, and unfortunately the Wi-Fi is not very good. So I will, yeah, I've got the chat. So trying to see if I can find questions, because there's a really like interesting, vibrant conversation going on in the chat about various things. So I'm just trying to see if I can, yeah, I think it's mostly just a conversation more than anything. So maybe if people want to like maybe raise a hand if they have a question.
I think there's one there from Amy right at the bottom, but that's the first question that we've got. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, yeah, I'm kind of struggling to see that, so maybe, yeah, it would be great actually maybe if someone could read out the questions, because I actually just can't see them on my phone. Sorry.
I'll read it. It says, it mentions me. Pegaloi has already talked about the process of discovery, which is a great insight. On a related note, I'm very interested in and soon teaching about the intersection of witchcraft and dark academia literature, such as The Raven's Duology by Cass Morgan and Danielle Page, 2020 to 2022, A Lesson in Vengeance by Victoria Lee, and the African Root Magic Legendborn series by Tracy Dion. But this goes all the way back to older works like Conjure Wife by Fritz Lieber from 1943 and its many film adaptations. Do you have any thoughts about the link between boarding school, college, feminism, and teen witches? In other words, how the current genre of dark academia literature connects academic study to witchcraft? I'm going to just briefly just put in my 2 cents, which is to say Suspiria and Satan's School for Girls, which is a really bad, like 1970s made for TV movie. But I'd love to hear what other people have to say about that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And I do think like there is, and I'm sure people have mentioned it in this panel with regard to characters like Sabrina and Willow as well, there does seem to be this sort of interesting connection between learning and acquiring knowledge and witchcraft, because even when you have characters who are born witches, they still need to learn about it and they still need to study it. So even in the original Sabrina the Teenage Witch series, you know, she has to study for her witch license. And maybe one thing that's kind of interesting about it, about how a lot of, not all, but a lot of teen witches are represented, is that they're not necessarily just women who come into these powers and, you know, that's it. They often have to study and learn about it. So there's often a connection between girls and learning and academia that maybe we don't see in other genres. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on that.
It's a great question though. Conjure Wife is one of my favorite texts for slightly different reasons, but I do think it's a really interesting link. And as well, often in witch narratives, you find that male characters are very academic, and they're like the expert, they're really rational and knowledgeable, but then the women characters, who are often the witches, are actually irrational, and they have this intense power, intense emotions, but they kind of have to be taught how to use it or control it, or it's sort of superintended and managed in some way. You see it in Charmed with the elders, the council, and then Buffy with Giles. And I do think I know it's not really what the question was about, but I do think it's interesting in like an academic sense.
Yeah, and the other thing that I talk a bit about in my own work as well is the fact that quite often the idea of witchcraft being associated with learning and having to speak Latin and peruse all these arcane texts, that's often associated with white teen witches, whereas, for example, Black teen witches are associated with forms of magic that are more intuitive and more connected to the body. So there's this polarization where white teen witches might be associated with the intellect and the mind, and Black teen witches might be associated with like the body. And that's really problematic because of the history of women of color being associated with the body and being kind of locked in to a sort of very problematic representation of corporeality. So there's some interesting trends there. I did see a question a minute ago, and I'm just going to bring it back up, from, I believe it was Lucinda, who was asking about the connection between the satanic panic and how we imagine teen witches. And I think that's a really good question, because it's something I've thought about in my own work. And I do think that like the teen witch does sort of maybe go quiet for a period. The representation of the character does kind of disappear almost in kind of like the late 80s and early 90s. You do get things like the film Teen Witch, and that's kind of a silly comedy, but you don't get very many sympathetic, complex portrayals of teen witches in kind of the 80s and the early 90s. It kind of vanishes. It becomes more sensational, more sinister. And it's not until you get to kind of like the mid 90s again with Sabrina and Buffy and the Craft, when the satanic panic has kind of died down, that you start getting these complex, nuanced teen witches again. So I kind of wonder if maybe one of the primary results of the satanic panic was the sort of the disappearance of the kind of complex, nuanced teen witch. I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to say about that, because I find the satanic panic fascinating.
I mean, certainly it was sort of the rise of Reaganism, and under Reagan, the rise of the moral majority, which I think kind of caused this weird dearth of occult films that had to do with witchcraft, because we certainly saw such a boom of them in the 60s and 70s. And then, of course, on the heels of that, then we saw the satanic panic happening in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So yeah, the timing of that was all very odd. But what I think one of the sort of major points of the whole satanic panic was this whole like, won't someone please think of the children? It's this thing that's it's the satirical thing you see it in The Simpsons or whatever. It's just because it's the children, and then and also about the rock lyrics, the rock and roll lyrics that are about Satan worshiping or whatever, and all these dangerous things for the children. And, even now, then when we saw with the Columbine shooting and those two boys and, were wearing black and they were playing games called
they were goths, yeah.
And so there's always this idea that somehow media and all these other influences are somehow gonna like warp our children. And then like the burning of the Harry Potter books and the whatever. So there's always some weird connection to this thing that people are interested in is going to destroy our children.
Absolutely.
And I have many more things I could say about that, but here in the United States, we've had 2 mass shootings by 18-year-olds in the last month, and I'm really not the person to weigh in on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And though I think one thing you mentioned that is quite interesting is that like a lot of the the whole kind of the role of children and the vulnerability of children, it's interesting that so many of those anxieties during the era of the satanic panic, that witches are kidnapping children and that witches are abusing children or killing and eating children, so many of those
Or
ideas
young,
go.
young women being impregnated. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that was another big thing I wanted to mention. Young girls were like recruited into these
Yeah.
cults, and then, you know, forced to have sex and forced to bear children, and then those children were buried under the floorboards or whatever.
Yes.
And the FBI convened a special task force to find all these dead babies, and there weren't any. And I think it's no coincidence that that's so close to the abortion rhetoric, you know, like all the
It is.
dead
But
babies
you know,
everywhere.
it also fascinates me how close some of those ideas are to some of the stereotypes that surrounded the satanic witch in the early modern period. You know, when that stereotype comes into being and they're like, oh, well, witches are killing and eating babies and that's what they do at their Sabbaths. And there's kind of a recurrence of these ideas. There was a question, I think it was from Lindsay, where she was asking, were there any texts that any of us had encountered that got the practice of witchcraft right, or were accurate in some way, as opposed to just sensationalist or, you know, entirely fantasy based? And maybe Peg and Shannon in particular, because you work on, you know, actual religious witchcraft, you might have something to say on that.
I think because witchcraft can be such an individual practice, it's hard. I don't think you'll ever find one text that will satisfy everybody. And I say it's an individual practice. Obviously, there are covens and people who practice together, but generally it is an individual practice, even, you know, when covens and people, individuals too, do engage for the collective good. So I don't think you'll ever find something that everybody is happy with. So I honestly can't think of one.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Peg? Have you encountered anything that you thought had a particularly good representation of witchcraft? Or
I think Shannon just gave a terrific answer, which is that, I mean, eclecticism has been, you know, sort of part and parcel of modern witchcraft practice ever since the 1970s. And so there's the idea of individual choice and individual, you know, adoption of different practices and beliefs. I think it's very much a part of it. And back in the day with Witchvox, you know, with the Witch's Voice, people would often ask us to speak on behalf of the witchcraft community. And we would always say, we can't do that because we don't speak for everybody, nor would we ever want to. But there's a new film, there's two new films I really want to recommend that do a very, very interesting take on witchcraft. One of them is a Macedonian film that premiered at Sundance called You Won't Be Alone. And it is stunning, and it's really subtle, and it's really just gets at the heart in a way of what, you know, real natural witchcraft is, but it's also based on this old, you know, folk tale. Anyway, I don't want to say too much about it because it's really amazing. And Alice Engler, who was in Beautiful Creatures, is actually in it, as is Naomi Rapace, who's been in everything. There's also this really cool film on Shudder, if you get that network. And I think you can try it out for free, whatever. It's fairly new by this little indie filmmaker collective yes, Hellbender, exactly.
I've been waiting to see that. I'm dying to see it, actually.
Cool. Super cool. And I recommend that. It's a very interesting, it's kind of a coming of age kind of a story as well. So, but in terms of getting witchcraft practice right, I don't think there is a right thing, but I think the original craft, if you really look at it closely, not only were those young women practicing a really earthy form of sort of Wiccan witchcraft in a way, but the imagery and the themes of the film follow these sort of elemental basis of Wicca, you know, in terms of the four girls, the four directions, the four elements, you know, colors, everything. That's really all there, which I think is quite interesting.
And the craft had a Wiccan consultant as well.
They did. Pat Devin, I actually interviewed her back in the day, and there's all this stuff around whether they actually adopted a lot of her ideas, which was pretty great.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And actually, this kind of links to one of the questions in the chat. Someone was asking, did anyone have any thoughts on the craft legacy? Like I did watch it for the book, and I kind of felt like it was a bit superficial, and I didn't really come away with much to say about it. I think I gave it, I'm sorry, but like I gave it a footnote in the book because I felt like it just didn't do anything. It was very superficial. One of the characters is
there are some I didn't mean to interrupt you. There are some scenes that were not included that you can now deleted scenes, which do
Oh,
add a
okay.
bit more. And I really wish
Because
they'd been in the original film because it's missing a lot.
one thing
Yeah.
that I think is really sad and a real waste of potential with that film is that one of the characters is trans. She's a trans teenage girl, but it's like mentioned in a throwaway line, and you know they don't explore that, and it would have been so interesting.
Completely, yeah. Completely
Um,
agree with that. She says, us trans witches got our own magic. And then there's nothing else. It's like,
Yeah, and it's such a shame because
let's
I
see
think
that.
that,
Yeah.
you know, like what is witchcraft for a young trans girl? How is the experience of witchcraft different from that perspective? How might witchcraft, you know, be employed in that personal, you know, discovery or that personal journey in a way that is different from how witchcraft might feel to a cis teenage girl? Like that would have been really interesting. And I feel like it was kind of a waste of potential. So that
Yeah,
was
I think
unfortunate.
there's a lot of interesting ideas in that film, like the men's rights activist played by David Duchovny that was
Oh
so
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
There was a lot of really great potential that I felt wasn't quite developed. I don't know that it's entirely the fault of the writer director, Zoe Lister-Jones. I think that the producers wanted to keep it this short and sweet thing. And it's like, okay, well, we have a mention of that and we have this representation. And so it's so much
Yeah.
better than the original in that way. But
Yeah, I feel like they were just ticking boxes.
I do think the character of Timmy was kind of amazing. That actor did such a great job. And then of course he's not there long enough either.
Yeah,
But what they were trying to say with that character was intriguing to me.
yeah,
You know, this
absolutely.
white male who suddenly transforms, you know, into a
Yeah,
better
yeah.
person.
Yeah, that was interesting. There was another question in the chat. I think it was from Sean, who was asking, like, is there a difference in how different forms of media represent witches if they're drawing on, say, a Christian archetype, so a satanic witch, as opposed to media that is using a sort of pagan template? Has anyone noticed a difference between, we'll say, I mean, like I'm thinking, you know, there's Sabrina, for example. The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina includes both elements of the satanic witch and pagan witchcraft. But do any of you see a difference between those works that are drawing on kind of the satanic archetype borrowed from Christianity versus the kind of maybe the newer neo-pagan archetype?
I think this is just based on that episode of The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. One thing I remember was the Church of Night, so Sabrina's church. They were having a picnic or a celebration, and they encountered the pagans. And although Sabrina and witchcraft within Sabrina it does draw on that satanic witch a little bit, and that Christian depiction of what witches are. I would have assumed when the pagans came in that the pagans would have been like these nature loving people, but actually they were trying to sacrifice virgins, which I would have assumed to be very Christian idea of what a witch would be. But no, it was the opposite way around, and you could go a little bit then deeper, and they were sacrificing virgins because, you know, they were pure and things like that, compared to how the satanic witch in Sabrina is shown, and that's, you know, you're encouraged to engage in all sorts of pleasures and things, and they have Lupercalia, a celebration entirely dedicated to that. So they're in that one example of Sabrina, they are depicted very differently, and it was actually a little bit surprising because I assumed it would have been depicted quite different, and the pagan depiction would have been quite different. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking of.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
Kind of confusing, that terminology, but I still thought it was a brilliant episode. That whole season was that whole storyline. But yeah, for people that, you know, take these things literally and really put a lot of stock in that language and that terminology, I think it was probably very confusing, but I still really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely. I'm realizing that we've gone way past our time limit, which again, I'm sorry, but like everyone has so many interesting things to say, and like we have great panelists and great questions. So apologies for that, but I do want to say, you know, thank you all so much for attending. I think this is going to be recorded and it's going to be on the BAFTSS website. So if you do want to catch up on this, or if you have friends who missed it, as we're finishing up, could I just thank our Our panelists, again, thank you all so much for coming. Like I said at the start, I invited you all here because your work has been a big influence on me, because I find what you're doing really fascinating, because I think that you have so many like interesting things to say to this to add to this conversation. So thank you so much. It was really wonderful to talk to all of you. I think I've been interacting with like all three of you via email and Twitter for so long, and it was just so nice to actually talk to you. But thank you everyone for this conversation. I think you can find some more information about what Peg, Chloe, and Shannon are up to in the chat. So the various projects they're working on, there'll be links in the chat as well. So thank you all so much, and massive thank you to Laura and Shelley and Kate and everyone from the Horror Studies Special Interest Group for hosting this and for like encouraging me. It sounds like they were like, you know, goading me into evil or something, which I guess they kind of were. But like, thank you all so much for this. It was a really wonderful way for me to launch what is my very first monograph. So thank you so much. It's very much appreciated. And do check the book out, and I hope you all enjoy it.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Thank you to our fabulous panelists, Chloe, Shannon, Peg, for a fantastic discussion. But extra special thanks to Miranda, and congratulations again on your brilliant book. And thanks to everybody for coming along. We'll have a one last event next month on TV horror before we have a couple of well-needed months off in the summer. So look out on our socials for more information. But yeah, thanks again, Miranda, and everybody, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.